Hey folks, I wanted to do another Star Trek video, but I skipped the step where I write a script that allows me to sound like a thoughtful, witty person with a point to make, in lieu of just sitting here rambling semi-coherently. And you know what we call it when that happens? Not actually Trek, actually. I want to warn you up front that this will be a video where I will be discussing not only Star Trek, but also current events and present-day political goings-on here in the United States. So if you are a person who isn't interested in that, or for whatever reason you don't like to get politics in your Star Trek, I mean, if that's the case, have I got some bad news for you. But anyway, if you just use Star Trek as escapism and you don't want to talk about or think about modern day, present day politics or whatever, or if you're one of those people who is willfully blind to the political side of Star Trek because you don't like the fact that it's inherently progressive and left-leaning in its politics, and you would just prefer that it weren't that, so you just you tell yourself a little lie and you pretend that that's not what it is, and it's just a pew 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 space show. If you're that, if you're that type of person, I wonder why you're even watching my videos. But if you are, this is going to be one of those videos, so maybe just don't watch it. It might not be your thing. If you notice me looking down in my lap every once in a while, everything's fine down there. There's nothing to worry about. But I do have some notes. I did take the time, even though I didn't write a script, I wrote out some notes, so I have some bullet points to kind of keep me on task for this video. So if you catch me glancing down every once in a while, it's because I'm looking at my notes. And now that I have brought that into the video and made it a part of my presentation, it's no longer a flaw in the presentation. And that's a good lesson for all of you out there. It doesn't just work in YouTube videos. It works in life as well. I was thinking a lot about Star Trek over the last couple of days with some things that have been happening in the world lately, in my country lately, the United States, in case you didn't know. And I thought about, Star Trek, what I've said before, like Star Trek being comfort food. And there are times when I think Star Trek is really good to have around, to use as comfort food, to be the warm, fuzzy, comfortable blanket that we can wrap ourselves around when we need a refuge from a confusing and frightening at times world. But Star Trek can also be reassuring and instructive when we look at it in light of current events. And that's more what I want to talk about in this video. It's probably too early to tell because we're still living it out and it's not over yet, unfortunately. But if I had to guess, I would say that the treatment of immigrants and refugees will go down in history as the most offensive and inhumane part of the presidency of Donald Trump. Just in the last few days, we've seen American Border Patrol agents launching tear gas at people who are on their side of the border, people who came up to the edge of the United States, who are refugees. We've been calling them a migrant caravan, but what they are is they're refugees. They're people who are homeless and unarmed. Many of them are children, and they've fled violence or economic instability, poverty, what have you, in Central America. And they've come to this country to seek refuge, to seek asylum. And they were gassed. They were tear gassed the other day. So when I turn to Star Trek looking for relevance rather than escapism, and when these are the sorts of things that are happening, the sorts of things that are on my mind as I turn to Star Trek or flee to Star Trek looking for something, there's really only one area of the franchise that I can go to when these are the events that are on my mind. And it's my favorite corner of the Star Trek universe, which is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. The first DS9 episode that I thought would be good to watch in light of the crisis at the border and the vilification and mistreatment of immigrants by Donald Trump, his administration, and I must add, his millions of loyal supporters who are all complicit in the crimes and offenses of Donald Trump, and that complicity will scar them and stain them for the rest of their lives. When I think about all that, the episode of DS9 that comes to mind is an episode called Sanctuary from the show's second season. This is a good episode whether there happens to be a refugee crisis going on at the time or not. It's a good showcase for Nana Visitor as Kira, always one of the strongest members of the ensemble cast. It deals with the continuing recovery of Bajor following the Cardassian occupation. It features William Shallert playing a saxoboom. What's not to love about this episode? But its story feels particularly resonant in this moment. A group of people from the Gamma Quadrant come through the wormhole. They are the Skreans, and they've been searching the galaxy for this fabled planet called Kentana, and they believe that this planet is destined to be their new homeworld now that they have finally escaped centuries of servitude thanks to the Dominion conquering their former oppressors. One of the only instances in the show where we hear about the Dominion doing something that is arguably kind of good, although the implication is that it was just by accident. The Dominion conquered these other people who happened to be enslaving the Skreans, and as a result, the Skreans got to escape and gain their freedom. So there's some tension in this episode between the Skreans and the other residents of Deep Space Nine, but things don't seem too bad until, that is, Hanik, who has been selected by the other Skreans to be their leader, informs Kira that they believe Bajor is their long-sought-after new home. They think that Bajor is Kentana, that they've been searching for all this time, and they mean to settle there. We're told there are over 3 million Skreans in total, and ultimately the government of Bajor decides not to accept them. There's a crisis late in the episode when Hanik's teenage son, Tumak, who has been bullied by Nog ever since he arrived, steals a Skrean ship and makes a run for Bajor. There's a confrontation with some Bajoran ships under orders to stop any Skrean ships from landing. Then Tumak's ship, which is already heavily damaged from the long space journey, explodes, killing Tumak and the others on board. At the end of the episode, rejected by the Bajorans, the Skreans accept an offer from Commander Sisko to settle on this other planet, Draylon 2. Hanik tells Kira as they're leaving that the Bajorans have made a terrible mistake in turning the Skreans away, saying that they could have helped each other, but now that won't happen, because the Bajorans have allowed their own experiences with the Cardassians to make them frightened and suspicious. First and foremost, this is a really good episode because it presents a nuanced look at a very complex situation. It's a complex issue in real life, and in the episode, it's a very complex situation when these Skreans show up from the other side of the wormhole and they need a new place to live, and then all of a sudden they decide, hey, you know what? We want to live on Bajor. And what I appreciate about it is that both sides of the issue are understandable and are valid. The Bajorans have understandable reasons for ultimately not allowing the Skreans to settle on Bajor. And the Bajorans don't reject the Skreans because of any bigotry or prejudice against them, at least not that we're ever shown. That doesn't seem to be the case. It's not, I don't think it's suggested in the episode that might be the case. It's merely a concern that Bajor itself is too weak. It's still rebuilding after the Cardassian occupation. Their resources are still very limited. They're still worried about whether or not they're going to be able to take care of their own people, and they don't think they will be able to absorb a population of 3 million refugees all at once. But you can also see things from the Skreans' side, and I think they have a very reasonable case to make too. One of the things that Hanik says a couple of times in the episode is, we just want the land. We just want a place to live. Bajor has plenty of room. There's plenty of land on Bajor that is not occupied, that we could occupy, and we could do something with it. We're farmers. We know how to work the land. We could help you. There's a drought on Bajor. We're told there's a famine in parts of Bajor. And the Skreans are like, hey, give us the land. We can help. We can make food for ourselves and for you. You won't have to look after us. You won't have to take care of us. We're farmers. We can take care of ourselves. Hanik's final line to Kira as she's leaving the station for the last time with the other Skreans, and they're on their way to Draylon 2, she says to Kira, you're making a mistake, and our two peoples could have really helped each other. And now we'll never know. And that is sad. Whatever the reason is for the Skreans and the Bajorans not coming together at the end, whether it's a good reason or not, the fact that they won't, and the fact that they will never know what they could have done together, that's sad. I also like the fact that the reasons that some people living on the station have for not welcoming the Skreans when they show up ring very true. There's a lot of very closely observed behavior on the show among the people who aren't too happy to see the Skreans that I think will be familiar to anybody who has argued about immigration with someone who is on the anti-immigrant side. The person whose complaints we hear the most is Quark, and Quark is only, as usual, Quark is only concerned about himself. He sees the Skreans as a threat to his business. He says they take up space and they don't buy anything. And oh, their skin, they leave skin flakes everywhere. They're disgusting and they're hurting my profit. My revenues are down because of all these Skreans all over the station. And there's this one brief but very sharp scene where, as I mentioned earlier, Nog has sort of been bullying the Skreans, particularly Tumak, and a couple of Tumak's friends who are always sort of roaming the station together. And there's a scene where Tumak and his friends show up and they sort of confront Nog, and Jake is there as well, and they get into a fight. There's a little scuffle on the upper level of the promenade, and Quark is the first grown up on the scene, and he shows up and he breaks it up, and he sort of tells the Skrean teenagers to get lost. And then as they're walking away, Quark says, well, I can see that the Skreans don't bother to teach their children manners. And Quark says this while Nog is right there, and at this point in the series, Nog is basically a juvenile delinquent. So Quark, as is the case with many of us, as is the case with a lot of people who turn their criticism outward but hardly ever inward, Quark is keenly aware and very seriously, very gravely concerned about the flaws and the misbehaviors of the immigrants, of the refugees, but he's apparently blind to the flaws and the misbehaviors of himself and his own people. That happens a lot, and that's a very pointed scene in this episode that I really, really love. This episode, it made me think of communities in my country that have welcomed refugees. And this goes back to the Kira and Hanik scene where Hanik says, we could have helped each other. We could have made, if you had let the Skreans come to Bajor, we could have made Bajor better. Because there are towns in the United States that have welcomed refugees where that very thing has happened. There are many examples that I could cite, but the one that I'm most familiar with is the town of Erie, Pennsylvania. Because there was an article about this in The Atlantic a couple of years ago, and it's also been profiled a few times on Marketplace, the business show on public radio. It's like the only business stock market related thing I ever pay attention to, but I try to listen to Marketplace every now and then. And they've profiled Erie, Pennsylvania a couple of times in the last few years with a focus on their refugee community. And Erie, Pennsylvania is one of those towns that has welcomed refugees. They've welcomed refugees from Syria and Somalia and Iraq and Sudan, going back decades, going all the way back to the 70s, and welcoming refugees who came to this country from Vietnam after the Vietnam War. And the refugee communities in Erie have revitalized that town, have really given it a shot in the arm, and given Erie a new life. They've raised employment. They've led to people starting businesses. Both refugees and people who were there before the refugees got there have started small businesses, have taken advantage of the new population, people who are working and earning money and have money to spend. And they've enriched the culture because the town has welcomed the refugees, has embraced them, has helped them to get started in their new lives in the United States through a combination of government programs and private charity, and have made them a part of the community. And the town is better for it. And there's another thing about this episode, Sanctuary, that it's not really the focus of the episode. It's not what the episode is about, because it's not where the drama winds up being. The drama of the episode winds up resting on the answer to the question of, will the Bajorans accept the Skreans or not? But in addition to that, we have the reaction of the Federation to the Skreans coming through the wormhole and needing asylum, needing refuge, needing a new place to live. And the Federation is a much better analog for the United States than Bajor, which is still recovering from the occupation. It's still a war-torn place that is putting itself back together, whereas the Federation is the most powerful community, the most powerful nation, if you will, in at least in the parts of the galaxy that we see in Star Trek typically. And when the Skreans show up, the Federation offers them refuge, offers them a place to stay, and offers them assistance immediately. I mean, Commander Sisko and Dax are picking out a new planet for them as soon as they get there. I mean, the next day they're like, "Oh, Draylon 2 looks good." There's never any question that they will be welcomed and they will be helped by the Federation. And in fact, you could look at Deep Space Nine as a whole as being a show about a powerful, wealthy nation with plenty to go around and plenty of room, going out of its way to help a less fortunate people get back on its feet. Because at least for the first half of Deep Space Nine, before it sort of shifts focus and becomes mostly about the conflict between the Federation and the Dominion, Deep Space Nine is about the rebuilding of Bajor. Not every single episode is about that, but the overarching storyline, the premise, the reason that Commander Sisko and the other Starfleet officers are there is to facilitate the rebuilding of Bajor following the Cardassian occupation and to get Bajor ready to join the Federation. That's what the show is about. And that is what a strong, wealthy country with plenty to go around and plenty of room, which claims to uphold principles of equality and justice and humanitarianism, should do in that situation. When refugees, when immigrants, when homeless people, when people who are fleeing persecution or fleeing economic ruin or natural disaster or whatever, when they show up at your border, that's what you should do. You should let them in and you should help them as much as you are able and welcome them. That's not only what such a nation as the Federation or the United States should do. That's the only thing that you can do if you want to live up to those ideals. If you want to not just be a nation that says it's good, that says it's committed to justice and equality and mercy and humanitarianism, but you actually want to be that nation. And that's an example that, if you like, you can take from Star Trek. The attitude that we see time and time again shown by Starfleet officers, by representatives of the Federation, toward people who need help. And that is to help them, which is what we should do in the United States when refugees show up at our border. It's the only thing we can do. It's the only thing we should do. Not to turn them away, not to make excuses, not to treat them like enemies, but to open the door and let them in. That's what the Federation would do. That's the lesson that Star Trek teaches us. It's not the only thing that teaches us that lesson, and it's a shame that we would even need a work of fiction to teach us that lesson, but some of us clearly need to have that lesson taught. And if there's any lesson that we should be taking from any version of Star Trek in this moment, I think that is one of the most important ones. The humane, accepting, helpful, open acceptance of refugees and immigrants to this country. That's what Commander Sisko does in Sanctuary, and that's what we should do in the United States when people come to our country for a refuge. We should be that refuge. Anyway, that's my Star Trek ramble. I hope that was watchable. I hope that was acceptable. I do want to mention a couple things before I wrap this up, and that is, first of all, if you're not listening to the Ensign's Log podcast, you should listen to the Ensign's Log podcast. It's a show where myself and Jason Harding portray characters. It's an improv comedy podcast. We play low-ranking officers on a certain famous Federation starship that is embarking on a certain historic 5-year mission. Each one of our episodes takes place during the events of one of the classic episodes of the original Star Trek series. So we sort of are doing our own thing on top of the established Star Trek mythos. And it's been so much fun and so creatively rewarding. And a lot of you are listening to it now because I've been mentioning it at the end of all of these Trek Actually videos. And I really, really appreciate that. If you have not been checking it out, and you want to see if it's your cup of tea, it is linked in the description of this video. You can listen to the episodes on SoundCloud, or there's a link to the RSS feed that you can subscribe to using the podcast app of your choice, and you get the new episodes whenever they get posted every week. Every Friday is usually when every other Friday is when Jason puts up new episodes. So check out the Ensign's log if you would. It's just my favorite thing ever. Also, starting this month, I am doing a poll to choose new topics for the proper episodes of Trek Actually. Not the not actually ones that I just kind of half-ass like this episode, but the ones I actually take the time to script and write and make really good. From now on, my Patreon patrons will be helping me to choose the topics of upcoming Trek Actually videos. Now, the next Trek Actually subject has already been chosen by me, and that's going to be another Captain Kirk video. It's going to be about Captain Kirk and how the events of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, are basically all his fault. But after that, starting in January, the topics will all be chosen by my Patreon patrons, who will vote in polls. And the first poll to decide the January Trek Actually topic is open right now. So you can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel, to support whatever I do here on the channel for a monthly donation, $1 or more. And one of the perks that you get is, from now on, you get to vote in the Trek Actually topic poll. So go check that out, vote, listen to the Ensign's log. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time. I'll see you in a couple days for a non-Star Trek related video. It'll be a Steve and Stuffy video. And then I'll see you in a couple more weeks for the next proper Trek Actually video, which will be another Captain Kirk video. We'll talk about Captain Kirk and the Wrath of Khan. So that'll be fun. Thanks for watching. See you then.